And now, Chris, we're going to talk about Nick Kyrgios. I held back on him in the first half because I feel like we need a little bit of a segment on him because there are just so many questions, so many talking points to really kind of dive into for a player who, as I say, has been off the tour for a long, long time, almost basically like 2 years, has come back, had a match, has had a Grand Slam match, and is already sort of talking on retirement. So yeah, there's lots to unpack here. Yeah, I guess the most interesting question, let's start there. What is next for Nick Kyrgios? Because he spoke about retirement in his post-match press conference. Yeah, where do you think this leaves him?
Well, he did, and I think people were a bit surprised to hear this because he was just mounting his comeback. You know, he said he's probably played his last singles match in Australia. He was really kind of taking all of that in, and that's quite surprising. I think he did talk about the fact that, you know, he was thinking whether he would go off and retire, but he said he didn't want to throw in the towel and retire in that match. He was hurting physically. I also do think that he's a man with an ego. So I think potentially, you know, some of those comments saying, you know, you respect your opponent, you know, people waited to see you play. I do think that some of that is actually what you say when you are hurting, both physically and mentally, following a really tough match. I think we've seen that before when people have made comments saying that this might be the last match that they play. I'm not saying it's similar at all, but Danielle Collins said after her loss in Australia that this would probably be the last time she'd be here. And things can change. Obviously, that was very, very different to Nick Kyrgios's sort of the physical issues that he has been talking about. So I do think you take this with a pinch of salt because if Nick decides that he is playing well, if the results pick up, do I think he'll continue playing? And do I think he likes the spotlight of it? Yes. But do I think he likes the rigor of regularly practicing to the level and you know, getting your body physically to the level it needs to be? I don't think that's what he loves. I think he loves the showmanship of playing. And it's not that fun when you lose, especially after everything he's been saying off the court.
And I mean, he's been off for 2 years to flick that switch, to go from there to back into ATP tour mode,
5 set,
grinding week in, week out, playing all those practice matches, hitting those practice balls, getting yourself up to a level. It's so tough. It's not just like you can just walk, even for a player who is, you know, naturally talented, even for those others, it doesn't necessarily, you know, get results, and you need to put that practice in. And it'll be interesting to see whether Nick Kyrgios is up to that, because I sense sometimes whether he just wants to play with his mate Thanasi Kokkinakis in the doubles, and he just sort of maybe prefer that as opposed to trying to go all in on the singles and maybe win a, you know, Grand Slam title.
Yeah, and he talked about the fact that he has no regrets. He says he's achieved a lot, but he has no regrets if he were to hang up his racket. I actually think that one of the most engaging times of his career was when he really did believe he could win Wimbledon. And I think that was that sort of second peak that he had where he really showed everybody that he was a very serious contender. And then obviously there were a few things that happened after that with injuries, for example, which meant that he has had to step away, having so recently actually made a final at a slam and his maiden final at a slam. So that is a big shame. And I think sometimes you say that to protect yourself from the reality of a situation where everyone thought potentially his career would go a little bit differently. He got it back on track, and then the injury side of things has really derailed it. And then when you're, as you say, getting yourself back into it, all that training to get a first round loss, I mean, it's a bit like when Naomi Osaka was coming back as well, and then you don't get to where you want to be. It doesn't come immediately. And you're losing to players who are younger than you, who are, you know, barely inside the top 100. That's not the Nick Kyrgios, or not what Nick Kyrgios gets out of bed for in the morning. So I can understand those comments. In terms of the level, you know, he didn't win a set here. He's been talking a lot of talk, and a lot of people expected him to have to come out and play some big tennis because of what he's been saying off the court. Do you think that his tennis was big enough? Do you think he's made any sort of statement with any of the results or the tennis he's played since he's returned?
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering to myself, can I see this player, you know, ultimately maybe further down the road getting back to a Grand Slam conversation, particularly I think around Wimbledon, because if there is a court surface that I think can mask maybe, you know, your, you know, desire to put in all the practice, and you can rely on just a few shots here and there with the, you know, the serve that Kyrgios has.
Great doubles player
as well. So in the match against Fearnley, I'm not gonna lie, I felt like he made too many errors, and he left it too late in that third set to really kind of have a go at Fearnley. This is his second match back, so I don't think there was too much to really expect. But at the same time, this was a good opportunity to make a statement, because I think, when you talk the talk, when you have all that expectation, that pressure, and you come up against someone who, the casual fan is going to look at and is going to say they're unseeded, bit of an unknown, they should be doing better here. I think he maybe will be a little bit disappointed with what he left out on the tennis court.
I can see that. I think that is something where this was the match where even getting one win in Australia would have been big from a comeback. And I think it would have answered some of those questions. I think there are bigger questions. I do think the grass court season will be great to him. He also does have the punditry side of things. I think we also have to talk about the fact that a lot of people aren't particularly happy with him, and the fact that a lot of things he says off the court, the history of bad behavior, that he was also pled guilty to assaulting his ex-girlfriend. He was then rehired as a ESPN pundit. I think a lot of people are kind of, and a lot of what we saw on our social media as well, was people were not necessarily supporting him anymore. And it feels like we're sort of getting into, a bit of a Boris Becker side of thing, because he's also saying quite a lot of things about quite a lot of other players. He always has done that.
Yeah. So I've always been interested by this because, for example, he's had a lot to say about, Jannik Sinner. And I almost wonder if this first round match was against a top player, a seeded player, would that have changed the dynamic, and would that have brought out almost like a different Nick Kyrgios? Would that have actually been a better draw to have? Because it almost would have, like, in my head, like, energized him up, fired him up, to just kind of show, as I say, I need to back up this chat. Whereas against someone like Fearnley, he was sort of going in as the favourite, which felt a little bit unfair to Fearnley, because this guy's been off the tour for 2 years, waltzing back in. So yeah, it's tough. Do you think he would have maybe preferred to have a different a more seasoned kind of player higher up in the rankings to have a go at, just to have that sort of chainsaw off approach?
I mean, as a player, he does get fired up about certain things, and I think that's when he's got a point to prove. And now, obviously, he has got a point to prove, because a lot of people who don't think he can do it again, that's either going to go one of two ways. Either you're like, you know what, my body can't do it anymore, or you find a way. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily an option for him. I don't know the nature of his injuries at the moment or where they're at. But I do think that this could actually be almost like, I'm not saying he's necessarily the villain, but in tennis terms, some people think that he is. But his villain origin story, this could be when he gives it that final go and it motivates him, to get that win, maybe at Wimbledon on the grass against Jannik Sinner. But I mean, should there be a place for him outside of, like, this is the question that we have. Andy Roddick has been talking about, the fact that he's kind of called him a hypocrite. He's an influencer, basically saying that he's not really a tennis player anymore. He lives for the likes. Obviously, he's criticised the wild card that Leighton Hewitt's son got. And I just feel like, is he a tennis player first and foremost? And does he have to be a tennis player first and foremost for his continual involvement in the sport, because of how much controversy surrounds him?
Yeah, I know. It's funny. I was literally going to ask you the same, because, as you say,
really?
Some people might say he's a villain. Some people might say he's an influencer. Some other people might say he's a tennis player. Maybe we should have a vote to see what profession you think Nick Kyrgios is first. I mean, commentator. I do think there is, personally, I do think there is a place for him. The fact that he gets so many people talking, but so many people outside of tennis talking. I mean, when I talk to my friends who don't really follow the tour, typically in the top three talking points is, did you see what Nick Kyrgios said? What did you make of those Nick Kyrgios comments? And I do think he brings in an audience that, that not many people can do. And I think it's his abrasiveness that does that does do that. It does attract an audience that is different. So I do think there is a place for him, but I get that he's never going to be like everyone's cup of tea. And
tricky,
I do think
right?
it will. I still do think ultimately it will be a loss if he does decide to hang up his racket, because I do think it will be a case of unfulfilled potential, because you know, I do feel like at his peak, he can and should win a Grand Slam title in the
His
singles.
talent level so high, but I think that's a very interesting point to kind of leave on is that, you know, there should be a place for him, but I think at the same time he has to actually kind of get himself into a good place mentally, and he's talked about that a lot. I mean, he talked about that in his Netflix episode on Breakpoint, and you just feel like it's about getting yourself into a good place as opposed to, well, feeling good, doing good. And I think so often he hasn't done that previously. And although I don't necessarily disagree with everything he says about Yannick Sinner, I do completely disagree with the way that he phrases it and the way that he goes about it. So I think that's where I would like to see him have an opportunity to play some better tennis, but I would not like to see him have more opportunities off the tennis court.
Yes. Well, we'll see what the next move is. I believe he's in the Australia Davis Cup squad. I think that is
He's got
next...
the doubles.
The doubles, yeah.
And
So there was.
kokkinakis.
Oh, of course. Sorry, the doubles at the Australian Open. Yes, of course. Well, yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, let's see if he takes the court because he did have an abdominal injury, lest we forget, in the match against Fearnley. I'm not really sure it had too much of an impact on the result, if I'm being honest. I think that was a little bit unfair to the performance of Fearnley.